Roll up, gather round and welcome to the grand show. Tonight you'll see a range of talent from multiple daring universes, the death-defying escapades of The Walking Dead, the imperious thrills of The Wolf Among Us, and to round it all off, the big man bat himself, the Batman! Yes, what a scene we have in store for you, and I'll be your host for this evening's delightful, audacious, terrifying display. So without further ado, my name's Joshua, be sure to subscribe, and this is the Telltale Show. It's May 1982, the Falklands War rages on, the British and Argentines facing losses on both sides. While this is happening, the World's Fair opens in Knoxville, Tennessee. Over 100,000 people would attend and see the opening address from President Ronald Reagan. And over 2,300 miles away, in California, George Lucas, director of the marginally popular, you may not have heard of them, Star Wars series of movies, had just founded a new company, Lucasfilms Games. This company strangely didn't have the rights to make any Star Wars video games. Those were held by legendary brand Atari, who would cooperate with Lucasfilms Games to help fund their original founding. So they didn't have the rights to the one series they were well known for. Okay, that's a bit of a pickle, but they still had many talented creators on board with the potential to create experiences that were completely original. And in their Californian-based studio, that's what they set about doing. The company's first games, Ball Blazer and Rescue on Fractalis, releasing in 1984 on the Atari 5200 console. Game creation continued on throughout the 80s. The team focused on devising new, innovative ideas for expansive titles that raised the profile of what games graphically could look like. This aim began to falter as a new one rose in its place. Make games that centered around the notion of adventure. Make adventure games. Now, these types of experiences would be story-driven, interactive with the player via the use of certain exploration and or puzzle-solving aspects. Now, adventure games in the 80s were nothing new, the first of which, Colossal Cave Adventure, had made its way across the world in 1976. But it was to be Lucasfilms Games which would make the genre what it is today. The company would go on to distribute many a title in the adventure game category, including the incredibly well-received The Secret of Monkey Island, releasing in 1990. The game itself would take place on a fictional Caribbean-like island and involved a ton of puzzle solving. The player was able to interact with the game via a point-and-click system, a system perfect for the PC hardware it was optimized for at the time. As we made our way into the early stages of the 90s, the developer would be known as the best in the business when it came to these said adventure games. And along with the new decade came a new name for the gaming division. They would now be known as being a limb to the LucasArts company. With this new name, LucasArts would transition into their golden age. Hit games would be released one after the other. Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, Sam & Max Hit the Road and Full Throttle all being released within a small time frame in the early to mid 90s. I want you to remember that second to last one, okay? Remember Sam and Max. Alright, I'll be back later, okay? Anyway, these games all represented mainstay classics of the adventure genre and cemented Lucasfilms Games, or as they were now known, LucasArts, as the guys to go to if you wanted this particular brand of game. Adding to this, numerous up-and-coming young developers would begin and hone their craft within this studio's walls, such as the notorious Tim Schafer and a few more, which we'll get into. Don't worry, you did read the title correctly. This video is about Telltale, I assure you, we just haven't got there yet. Anyhow, as the 90s drew ever onwards, the popularity of adventure games would rather shrivel up and waste away. The public wanted the latest in tech, and they wanted the games that would utilize and show off that tech in the most apparent of forms. They wanted higher resolution images, they wanted better quality music and audio, pricey graphics cards were all the rage, and with the release of the 5th generation of home consoles, 3D graphics became the norm. All of these elements didn't really fit into the LucasArts model of adventure game development. They instead focused more on the integral systems, not on the flashier gameplay aspects that had grown in popularity. And that was fine, but customers wanted something else. So in an effort to fulfill this market expectation, LucasArts finally regained the licensing rights over their associated Star Wars franchise, and began forging entirely new games from said series. These games financially did well. Very, very well. so well that their focus started to shift from the creation of adventure games to the creation of these new Star Wars games that the public clamored for. LucasArts would then start the process of phasing out these games from the company's lineup, but the developer didn't immediately forget these adventure games entirely. They would instead go on to try to evolve them, giving those 2D experiences an extra D. The first game in this new style to be completed would be the sleeper hit of Grim Fandango in 1998, a game which would go on to win the company various awards and be praised for its multiple facets like musical score, art direction, and voice acting. Following this success, a fourth installment to the Monkey Island series was also released to a similar reception in the year 2000. This was great, but these games would only act as a farewell for now final lap around the track for adventure games made by LucasArts. Sequels to existing franchises for the developer had been announced in the early 2000s. These were sequels to Full Throttle and the, I hope you remembered it, the Sam and Max games. Unfortunately, however, quite late on in their development cycle, these two would be cancelled in 2003 and 2004 respectively. The latter's cancellation of Sam and Max would be announced via a succinct press release made by LucasArts. Their reason for the cancellation being the current marketplace realities and underlying economic considerations. Now, those considerations resulted in the new company president of LucasArts, Jim Ward, cutting staff from 450 members to just 190 a mere month after the cancellation. That's 260 talented game makers out of the door in just a month. And with this, LucasArts had made their position clear. LucasArts wanted more Star Wars games. LucasArts were not in the business of making adventure games any longer, and these layoffs presented an issue for 3 individuals working within the company who didn't much care for the direction LucasArts were going in. 3 men who still believed in the vast potential adventure games held. 3 developers who had been working on that cancelled Sam and Max game. 3 guys that still had more tales to tell. This is the history of Telltale. So it's July 2004. The new Sam & Max game had been cancelled, the team working on it laid off by LucasArts, and 3 men who had escaped the cut disagreed entirely with the new path the company was going down, and so they left and joined their forces together with the aim of keeping the adventure game genre alive and allow for it to thrive in this high-tech age of graphical prowess. These 3 forces of nature went by the names of Kevin Bruner, Dan Connors, and Troy Molander. Upon their departure from their former employers, the trio spent about 3-ish months brainstorming, organising, and getting everything in place to forge their own game development company. Now, they didn't want to move too far away from their base of operations, so they stayed in California, relocating ever so slightly to a building in San Rafael. Speaking in an interview that same year, their goal was to gain and use pre-existing story-focused licenses from well-known films, comics, literature, and television. Molander added to this, stating that their aim was to build a company where creativity is fostered and anything is possible. Upon consideration for the company's new name, it was Bruner who selected the chosen title. This development studio would be called Telltale Games. This name alluded to the group's wishes to create games that were lighter on the puzzle-solving elements than their previous projects, with a concentration on the more narrative-based side of things, to tell a tale to the user, if you will. And the first tale they intended to tell was a new game in the Sam & Max universe. You see this dog in a suit and a rabbit sidekick thing, I don't know the dynamic, but all we've got to know is that they are key to the Telltale story. For this would be the very first project they had their hearts set on making. They had worked on the cancelled game, they knew the franchise inside and out, they saw that there was a hardcore fan base that was upset at the cancellation. Of course they would want to continue its legacy, but there was one issue, well, there were 2. Number 1, to make any game of this sort you need a game engine, aka a set of tools with which you can create an entire game with. These things are no small feat to create, as they need to be malleable, easy to use when you create not only your first game, but your 10th game down the road. Game engines are often used by developers over the course of multiple years for numerous different games. For example, EA's Frostbite engine and its different iterations has been used by the company for the best part of 13 years, and it's been used for varying types of games like first-person shooters and sports titles. Needless to say, creating a game engine is an important step that could decide the longevity of your development studio, and Telltale were no different, so they had their hands busy with that. But I mentioned they had 2 issues, and that was only the first. The second problem they they didn't have the licensing rights for this Sam & Max franchise. Major issue, right? Well, you'd be correct in thinking that. The three had hired a small team to complete work on a new Sam & Max game, including lead game designer Dave Grossman. They'd done all this, but without the license, they couldn't even legally use any single element included in the franchise. Not the characters, not the story, not even the title art. And with LucasArts being unwilling to negotiate a deal for the rights with, nor license the work they had done on the cancelled game to Telltale, the new development team were left twiddling their thumbs for a while. The rights deal the Sam & Max creators had with LucasArts would expire in 2005, so the team would have to wait until then for a chance to get their hands on it. Until that time, they could still work on that pesky game engine anyway. And said engine would need testing, and what better way is there to test your game creation tools than to actually make a game using them? Trial and error is, after all, conducive to creation. And Telltale agreed. In that elapsed time period waiting for the rights ownership of Sam & Max to expire, they cultivated and released a rather simplistic game. This game was called Telltale Texas Hold'em. Not the narrative-centered experience Telltale had set out to make, but it didn't need to be. All this game needed to show to the small team of developers was that they could make a functioning product using their self-designed tools. They would name this new game engine they had just made rather aptly as the Telltale Tool, and with this first game they liked what they saw, what they had created. Buoyed by this, they would follow this experiment with another, their second game, Bone. Now Bone was an existing independent comic made by this guy Jeff Smith, and this is where we really saw the starting point for the Telltale model of business get its first run out. Telltale had licensed the rights to the series and would release the game in segments or episodes as they call them, their release dates scattered throughout the year. The first episode of Bone came in September 2005, the second April 2006, the third, well, the third never saw the light of day, for Telltale would move on to their main goal, what the founders split from their original company for, Sam & Max. With promises to return to Bone one day, promises that would be left unfulfilled by the way, they moved on to greener pastures, but the last time we checked they didn't have the rights to the franchise, so what had changed? Well, in mid-2005, the creator of Sam & Max, Steve Purcell, would not take the option to renew the license with LucasArts, opting to give the exclusive rights to Telltale instead. With their newly gained franchise, Telltale business escalated rapidly as they announced that work on the game had started in September that same year. In the background, they had also acquired the rights to create games based in the popular CSI universe. These games were okay. Anyway, back to Sam & Max. So the game was announced in September 2005. The game was to be called Sam & Max Season 1. Telltale really starting to cement their episodic release model of operations here. If the other games before were merely test runs, then this is what they all were leading up to. Now, I've mentioned the term episodic games rather offhand in earlier points in this video. Let's take a little bit of time to dive into what the term actually refers to, for it's rather important we understand this term as it's central to Telltale's whole story. Okay. Episodic game releases basically referred to when a developer creates, say, 2 hours of complete polished gameplay for their game. Now, this isn't the complete product, merely a section of it. Nonetheless, a company adopting this episodic series model would release those 2 hours of gameplay for purchase to the public as a Chapter 1 of the game. They would then get back to work on the second part, which would release anywhere from a month to a few months later. They would continue this process until the game with all its chapters are completely available to the consumer to buy either the standalone episodes, or they could just buy the season pass that includes both the first chapter and any chapters that will be released down the line. It's a different business model, but why would anyone actually release games in this way? Well, if done correctly, there are a ton of advantages to this model, and almost all of them are based around gaining the luxury of foresight. Say if you release one episode and it doesn't do well in sales, then you can drop it to make another game entirely. If it does do well, then you can get feedback from the players way sooner at a higher rate than you would if you release a game once every 3 years or so, something most major game developers do. Say the players like the character you were going to kill off, perhaps plans for the next chapter can be reworked so that character lives on. If management is organized, then you can even work on a high number of games at the same time, releasing them incrementally one after the other so your fans never lose interest in your series. You can also get that cash injection from your first episode sales much sooner than you would with any other release schedule. There are a lot of advantages, and Telltale saw all of these and with a small upstart team found that that model fit in just right with how they worked. And they utilized it to incredible effect with Sam & Max Season 1, the first episode dropping for most on October 17th, 2006, the second December 20th the same year, the third January 25th the following year, and so on and so forth, the team sticking to a 1-month development turnaround to get an episode of this game out. During this time they had used equity funding and an $825,000 private investment to keep them afloat. A high amount to most of us, but an unbelievably small amount to complete a game with. But the sales Telltale got from this game were relatively incredible also. Sam & Max Season 1 would not only keep the lights on, they allowed Telltale to begin to think about new projects, and they would continue in the pursuing of their business in the same way they had done thus far. A business concept lead designer of the Sam & Max game, Dave Grossman, elaborated on and praised, stating that the company works small enough that they don't need to have the license that's the biggest movie of the year, because then they'd be spending $20 million on the game, and so everybody in the world has to buy it in order to do it. Spending so much on licenses wouldn't be a sustainable business, Grossman purported. No, they would instead gravitate towards the more peculiar licenses, intellectual property most people hadn't heard about, and make that system work for them. And so they stuck to their guns, making and releasing a second game, or as they would call it, a second season of Sam & Max, the first episode coming out in late 2007. This would prove to be their second hit, as the game garnered critical and financial success for Telltale. Their episodic, periodically released business operation had been vindicated a second time. Lightning had struck twice. Now Telltale were quite happy with this, but as most successful companies are wont to do, they desired expansion, and they would do this by picking up smaller licenses here and there. An internet cartoon, Strong Bad's Cool Game for Attractive People, was licensed in 2008, and then they worked on a Wallace and Gromit title. Then came quite a monumental move. The team at Telltale went back to LucasArts and offered a deal for the rights to the infamous Monkey Island series. Now times had changed at LucasArts, as the prior president hadn't remained at his post for long. There was a new emperor in town, Darryl Rodriguez, who was a strong admirer of the older LucasArts adventure games, and so, using that admiration, the Telltale higher-ups had struck a deal with their former company. The rights for Monkey Island had now been transferred to the promising yet still smaller company. An episodic game using the franchise would release its 5 episodes over the course of 5 months, concluding at the end of 2009. Another Sam & Max season would follow, then some CSI games, then a few standalone mini titles such as Poker Night. Telltale Games had a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, but they could handle it. And as the clock struck 12 on December 31st, 2009, as we tiptoed our way into the 2010s, Telltale started to realize something. In sticking to their philosophy with their belief in classic adventure games and their quite magnificent and relatively unique business model, they had slowly ascended and climbed their way up the adventure game market, passing others as they went until they had reached the very top. Not a noteworthy competitor in sight. They were now the outright leading source of good quality classic adventure games. They'd taken a risk in breaking off from LucasArts, yes, but it had all been worth it. Founders Bruner, Connors and Melander had done it. Telltale Games was a name people were just starting to take serious notice of, innovators at the forefront of their field. The minuscule team had slowly grown into a 90-person strong unit, and the only direction they could go from here was up. Yes, the future appeared bright for Telltale Games, so why not try something a little bit more ambitious? It's now June 2010. Telltale had the adventure game market well and truly cornered. A third Sam & Max season's final episode had released a month or two earlier. Then came some more CSI titles. Telltale were rather happy with their progression in the gaming world, and they deservedly felt as though they could expand even further. With their first few titles, they had learned how to stand. With those games that came after, they started to walk. But now it was time to start running. It was time for the grander licensing deals to come into play. Telltale had grown their status over the years, enough to be at least in the running to make games surrounding the more popular franchises out there. And it was here in June 2010 where they would use that newfound status to attempt to broker deals with the big boys. This process kicked off with the signing of a deal with the massive Universal Studios. The deal being that Telltale would be allowed to create games based on both the sci-fi time-traveling hit Back to the Future and the thrilling, terrifying Jurassic Park movie franchises. One of the founders, Dan Connor, stating that this change in company direction represented an exciting next step in our continued growth as a mass-market games publisher and developer. The time of Telltale Games relying on lesser-known, obscure licenses was over. The first game to solidify this would be that Back to the Future episodic game. This game would feature a story which interwove with the original film's plots, featuring both the main characters from the series, Doc Brown and Marty McFly. Telltale would also get permission from both of the actors who played the pair, Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox, to use their likenesses in the game, the former actually reprising his role and providing the voice for the in-game character. They worked on the game for a little while and managed to release it before the end of 2010, the first episode of the game coming out on December 22nd for PC. Telltale put a minor amount more emphasis on releasing the game on consoles also, the first episode arriving on the PlayStation 3 in February 2011. All the chapters would be worked on until the final episode's release date, June 23rd, 2011. Now, the Back to the Future game was a crossroads moment for the developer. Would this expansion into bigger licenses work? Well, as the company began to see, it would. By 2010, Telltale's yearly revenue was set at a grand total of $10 million, a whole 90% greater than that of the previous year's figures. This is in no small part due to Back to the Future being, quote, their most successful franchise to date. Senior Vice President of Marketing Steve Allison going on to say that for most of Telltale's games, they tend to have to sell around 100,000 copies to make their money back on their investments. But the releases surrounding 2010 had been selling twice that number or more, Back to the Future being included in those games. Once again, Telltale had taken a business risk, and once again the reward outweighed said risk. There were no reasons for the alarm bells to start ringing, no barriers ahead of the California-based developer, and so they pressed onwards with the second game in that deal with Universal, Jurassic Park. This game would be a little different. The game strayed away from Telltale's tried and true method of releasing their games episodes periodically. Instead, they would just release them all in one go on November 15th, 2011 on all platforms, PC and consoles alike. And this game had a lot of issues. The game did away with most of the classic adventure game tropes. Puzzle solving was all but scrapped in favour of grand action sequences and fast gameplay elements. As seen with a focus on quick-time events and the time-limited choice-based system, players would be forced to choose an action in very little time, split-second decisions that could potentially decide your character's fate at the hands claws, tiny T-Rex arms of the oncoming dinosaurs. In addition, Telltale did away with their rule that the player character couldn't be killed, a rule that they had adopted from their LucasArts days. Character drama was way more prevalent also, centering on the interactions between your player and various non-playable guys and gals you come across. Telltale Games with Jurassic Park had changed, but they had changed so much about their formula way too quickly, it would seem. Jurassic Park did poorly with critics and didn't set any sales charts alight at Telltale HQ. The game flourished with its storyline but faltered with its gameplay. It was hampered by its frame rate struggles and dated looking graphics. Critics thought the title was only a game in name, acting as more of a kind of interactive movie. You chopped and changed between your player characters way too often, making the game appear jittery. It didn't flow. It did provide for some hilarious moments though. Also, a sprinkling of controversy was scattered around when Telltale employees attempted to boost the game's review scores by all posting 10 out of 10 reviews. People were rightly not happy about this, and the employees' reviews were removed shortly after. Telltale would somehow support their employees' actions, giving the reasoning that the staff were merely so proud of their work that they wanted to reflect that in their ratings. A likely story, a poor excuse. Allow me to give you a couple of better ones on behalf of the company. You see, Telltale was still a small developer at the time. They were still operating on a rather low budget. Nevertheless, they were ambitious, too much so maybe, but ambition is almost always a good thing. And in this context, with these reasons, the issues with the technical aspects of the game were certainly justifiable to a certain demographic. Okay, so Jurassic Park was a rather hefty swing and a miss for Telltale. However, as aforementioned, this new and and improved business model hadn't damaged their reputation and revenue at all. At least that was what was presented to the public at the time. In fact, apparently it had enhanced the money that was coming in. There was a general feeling of, so what if Jurassic Park had been a relative flop with critics? Telltale Games was experimenting, and experimentation isn't without its flaws. Unfazed, the developer wanted to continue with its current trajectory, with its current plan of licensing popular franchises. Back to the Future and Jurassic Park was seen as springboards onto bigger and better things. There was no turning back now. The company and its workforce had grown exponentially, its profits with them. Telltale Games would venture forth on this path and see where its winding bends and turns would lead them. And although they were ever optimistic, no one could have predicted just what rested around the corner. Telltale Games would strike gold. It's now 2011. Alongside the working on and the release of Jurassic Park, Telltale announced another two major licensing deals. They had attempted to approach legendary game developer Valve with a pitch for a spin-off game set in the in-game world of Left 4 Dead. Now these discussions would go nowhere, but two alternative conversations did amount to two deals. The first was struck with Warner Brothers for the rights to their comic book series Fables. The second deal with Robert Kirkman for the rights to his comic book series The Walking Dead. We'll be dealing with that second one first. Now, The Walking Dead at this time was not only a fan favourite comic series. No, for a few months before the Telltale deal was agreed upon, the series had been adapted into a television show. The first season had caused the series to explode into the public's collective consciousness. The Walking Dead television show would go on to be massive, drawing in viewership from across the globe. And watching all this, Telltale couldn't believe their luck. They had approached Kirkman at exactly the right instance where the license costs wouldn't be extortionate, and when the franchise was growing in stature with little to no effort on their part. And they had the creators Robert Kirkman's seal of approval as the author-artist extraordinaire, for Telltale were good at engaging the player in their narrative. He had been a big fan of the company's strong bad game, cool game for attractive people, and would go on to state that it was Telltale's apparent dedication to survivalist nature of the Walking Dead universe and the branching storyline aspects that made the decision for Kirkman to license the property to the adventure game company easy. The game would start production in 2011, Kirkman being an important consultant for the world building and indeed the writing of the game. The comic book writer would work closely with the main game writer Sean Vanneman. Now the deal had included provisions for a multi-year, multi-platform, multi-title model. They wanted these games to span over multiple seasons. That's some forward thinking right there. This long-lasting plan was bought into by both Telltale and Kirkman, the author having a significant impact on the game's story and its characters. And while he would allow the team at Telltale to get creative with his franchise, he had a few demands, one such demand being that Telltale not touch the main character of the original comic book series, Rick Grimes. Kirkman had his own wacky plans for Rick's journey and didn't want those to come into conflict with the game's story. Throughout the months of development, an early version of the game was shown to Kirkman, which he was left unimpressed by. But nearing the end of the game's production, he was shown an additional, almost final version, which he apparently responded to rather well. Now this near final build would show off what the game would entail. Telltale had used all the elements that had worked from Jurassic Park. Characters could still easily die in this world, the player's choices usually causing or halting their demise. The game would have a set of major choices per episode. Each one would, in theory, create vastly different storylines that would feel personal to the particular player. And at the end of each episode, a choices breakdown would appear, showing the player what percentage of players chose to make the same action they had made, as well as the percentage of people that had made different choices. The game drew inspiration for their cinematic sequences from fellow games out there, Heavy Rain and the Uncharted series, looking to a further game, Mass Effect, to see how to implement these meaningful choices in a long-running franchise of games. In the latter space-travelling, alien-destroying, planet-saving title, Mass Effect, they had adopted conversational trees in the form of a wheel of dialogue responses for the player to choose from. Pick this one, you're a bad person, pick this one, you're a good person. That kind of thing. A system Telltale Games thought of as unnatural. Connors would state that this system did not possess a believable rhythm to dialogue, so Telltale would implement a ticking countdown to most dialogue options with the aim to make the game flow, something they had been criticised for not doing on Jurassic Park. Anyway, once all of these elements were in position, Telltale was ready to drop their very first episode of this game on April 24th, 2012. Coming out on all major platforms, this episode was incredibly well received. Critically, the title was praised. Commercially, it rocked the sales figures, and it would continue to do so over the next 4 episodes they would release, the finale coming out on November 20th, 2012. Come January 2013, the game had made Telltale $40 million worth of revenue, selling over 8.5 million episodes. Fans and critics alike praised Telltale's writing of characters. The world building was on point as it captured the harsh tone of the Walking Dead universe, the need to struggle for even a snippet of a chance of survival. Every plot point had the audience on the edges of their seats. They were hooked. I was hooked on the story. The father-daughter-like relationship main characters Lee and Clementine possessed was possibly the most heartwarming and heartbreaking aspect many had ever seen in a game. The pair would go through so much after their first meeting in Clementine's family home. You take the reins as Lee, trying at every single possible juncture to make sure Clementine and the auxiliary characters you liked remained safe. Over the course of each episode, you face a number of obstacles in doing that. Raids, zombie infection, cannibals, that feeling of being surrounded and betrayed. Okay, so the animation quality wasn't quite top notch, some of the glitches carrying over from Telltale's previous projects, and the branching storylines quality may not have been entirely realised, the developer not giving players many actual meaningful choices, just making them appear more important than they actually were. For example, there were choices that the player could make where picking either option resulted in the same outcome, like in the scenario where you could choose to either save this guy or this young boy from some zombies. Either one you choose, the guy will still be the one to be that lucky zombie's hearty breakfast. This technique of game design is actually called the illusion of choice. You see, you had all these choices that did separate one person's story from the other, but they would be either scratched out an episode or two later or have little to no impact on the ending, which would always conclude in the same room with the same choice, with the same gut-wrenching final scene with Clementine pointing that gun at an infected, about to be zombified Lee. The decision of what you wanted to do in that situation was yours to make. The choices may have been the thing that got everyone intrigued in the game to start with, but it was the story and the central relationship between these two characters which got them to stay. Of course there were flaws, but that didn't matter to the vast majority. Telltale had created something incredible, a title worthy of standing alone without the license. Take the Walking Dead name off of this, change a few characters here and there, and you've got yourself a game that could stand on its own 2 feet. A game that would be touted to be the saviour of the adventure game genre. A game that won Telltale many an award, including Game of the Year from various award publications and shows. The full transition from classic adventure game habits into a more dramatised, character-driven experience was complete. Telltale Games had changed forever. It's 2013, October. A few months ago, Telltale had relocated to a larger space and expanded their workforce again from 125 to 160. Today, that deal with Warner Bros. Comes back into play in the form of a game based in the Fables universe. The game releases on October 11th with the title The Wolf Among Us. Now, the game had been in development hell for quite some time, the team assigned to it at Telltale ultimately struggling with the narrative of all things. The game's release was pushed back from its original early 2012 release window to late 2012, then again to October 2013, the day it would actually release on. Now, the delays were not ideal, but they did allow for them to incorporate the gameplay elements seen in The Walking Dead. The Wolf Among Us was an interesting title that featured mythical characters like Snow White and the Toad in a 1980s city setting. You played as Detective Bigby Wolf, or the Big Bad Wolf, as you tried to solve a string of mysterious murders of these various mythical guys. While not eclipsing The Walking Dead in sales, possibly due to the less popular franchise it was based on, this game once again received many of the same accolades as its predecessor got. Lightning had struck twice with that same formula. Focus less on puzzles, focus more on character interactions. But there wasn't time for celebration, as the team were working on and releasing the second season of The Walking Dead practically in tandem with The Wolf Among Us, their seasons concluding in August and July 2014 respectively. The Walking Dead Season 2 again did well, riding off the back of the previous season's success while retaining a couple of important characters that rather, in my opinion, carried the game, as the series strode away from its more grounded roots to create bigger action set pieces. Again, there were no warning signs for the company. This business model had survived for 3 games now. Then came the fan-loved title Tales from the Borderlands, another, you guessed it, episodic game, which was set in the established world of Borderlands, Telltale having acquired the license from creators Gearbox in around 2012. This is unclear when they actually received the rights, with the first episode releasing on November 25th, 2014, just 3 months after the conclusion of The Walking Dead Season 2. Once again, this game would be loved by the critics, but this time one element let it down: the amount of sales. Telltale management grew increasingly concerned at the relatively low amount of sales the game's episodes had attracted, so concerned that about halfway into the full release of its episodes, according to the game's co-director Nick Herman, Telltale considered cancelling the series altogether. This would allow them to reallocate staff to work on the more lucrative deals they had coming up, but the project leads managed to convince Telltale's higher-ups to allow them to complete the game with a skeleton crew. The reduced team did an admirable job, releasing all of the remaining episodes by October 2015, by which time the company had begun shifting heavily once more. Telltale had further increased their number of employees to 250, and they wanted a real change in direction for the company. Now, why was this? Well, they had done so well so far, but they still wanted more franchises, more games, more licenses. Each of these would lead to more money being deposited in the company account, and with the developers' previous experiences with the growth of their business, they had no reason to believe this would be a bad decision. So they wanted further expansion. To do this, they'd need to restructure the business to make sure it was able to cope with the planned influx of new titles. CEO at the time, Dan Connors, would step down from the role, being replaced by co-founder Kevin Bruner, the current firm president. Connors spoke on the move, stating that it was getting harder to cope with these growth-specific challenges, mentioning that Bruner would be the better choice for seeking out these expansion opportunities for Telltale going forward. This is the correct move, right? And what a noble move it was by Connors to do what was right for the company. This is no doubt the step in the right direction Telltale wanted to take, huh? Well, yes, but actually no. Internally within Telltale, there were those who questioned whether the move had been achieved via nefarious means. One employee preferring to stay anonymous, stating that this was the very beginning of the end for Telltale. But it couldn't be. Telltale were just going from strength to strength, knocking their franchises out of the park left, right, and center. The beginning of the end? No, this was the beginning of the beginning. It was onwards and upwards from here, with Bruner at the helm of the Telltale ship. Telltale Games, with this shift in management, had no doubt risen ever higher. It happened oh so quickly. It's now 2016, new CEO Kevin Bruner still reigns supreme, and in the same year he talks about how the Telltale studio, because of its restructuring work, had the ability to work on 4 major titles alongside one another, with more room for additional side projects, and they really could impressively achieve this, but not without grinding their employees into the ground. For the company under Bruner would morph from a hard-working, devoted and passionate workplace to a living nightmare. The studio would remain in a never-ending state of crunch and stress under the new CEO's watch. Current and former staff began making their feelings known in 2017 to multiple outlets. This provided onlookers such as myself much needed insight into just what was going on inside the Californian-based studio, and what we saw deviated from Telltale's happy public-facing persona. Workers were pushing on through these rigorous schedules day and night with the false hope that the almost daily rewrites to the game's story wouldn't pile any more work onto their already tired shoulders. Said rewrites weren't trivial, by the way. The higher-ups would change anywhere from 60 to 90% of content after each executive meeting. Developers working under Bruner must have felt trapped. They did the impossible, meeting most of their unfathomable target dates. And that's all that mattered to Telltale anymore, meeting those dates. To hell with the quality of the games, Telltale higher-ups just needed that constant source of cash flow into the company. So they needed the employees to work faster, harder, release more episodes for more franchises at a higher rate. Telltale would see the number of employees peak at 400 in mid-2017, but those extra hands were not brought on to help alleviate the pressure, no. They were there to work on new projects. So in difficult circumstances, the brave team worked on, and that monumental effort would lead to Telltale releasing a few titles in this period of their history. Titles such as the complete Game of Thrones series in late 2015, Minecraft Story Mode in in March 2016, The Walking Dead Michonne in April 2016, Batman the Telltale series in late 2016, another Walking Dead title in late May 2017, a Guardians of the Galaxy series in November 2017, Minecraft Story Mode Season 2 concluding its run in December 2017 also. I skimmed through them fast, right? Well, that's how it must have felt for the developers working on these games. Each of them were released episodically at a ridiculous rate. That's 7 whole games with a total average playtime ranging from 4 hours to 15 hours of gameplay, which all needed to be coded, designed, written, and fully developed by these overworked Telltale employees. And due to this harsh schedule, and almost needless to say, the game's quality began to slowly deteriorate as the years went on. The Telltale tool, the game engine which had been used to create every single Telltale game since 2004, was really starting to show its age. It didn't allow for the cutting-edge graphics we were seeing from other companies at the time. The understaffed quality control department were working 48 to 60 hours a week staring at screens, painstakingly poking and prodding 2 titles at a time searching for these bugs, but still missing them due to being exhausted. Now, Telltale's top-level executives not only continuously implemented the format from the original Walking Dead game, they had become obsessed with using it, restricting creativity and refusing alternative, more manageable systems. They alienated their workforce as some walked out the door. We're not even close to being done, folks. Bruner and the management team had also rather kindly created a culture of fear, threatening demotion or outright firing of employees that spoke out or missed target dates. They'd also meddled with the creation of their games. Entire stories were given a full tonal shift, exampled by Minecraft Story Mode. This title was meant to be a little bit more mature before being altered to be more family friendly. Telltale therefore were not taking that many risks with their franchises, looking to be more marketable. And then came the massive revelation. Anonymous sources stated that very few of the games were actually profitable within this period. Game of Thrones, Tales from the Borderlands, Wolf Among Us, and Guardians of the Galaxy were revealed to be financial failures. Batman the Telltale series being the biggest commercial failure in the company's then 13-year history. These are big franchises that Telltale paid the owners of said franchises a lot of money to have the licensing rights to. For Telltale to not even break even with these licensed games would destroy their business model entirely, and they hadn't been profitable for quite some time. Telltale had always been taking on water for years, and only now were they just starting to sink. Fast approaching the end of 2017, the Wolves had begun nipping at the developer's door. After his disastrous run, Bruner had finally stepped down or was voted out of his position from CEO earlier in the year. A new player, Pete Hawley, joining the crew to replace Bruner, who would remain on the board of directors but would fade from all day-to-day responsibilities entirely. There was a lot of hope that this new CEO, Pete Hawley, could turn things around. He even committed to staying after he had fixed the company to oversee its recovery firsthand. In November 2017, he had unfortunately had to lay off 90 employees, around a quarter of their staff, in an effort to keep the sinking Telltale ship afloat. However, most of these guys were part of the management team involved in Telltale's rapid decline. Hawley had considered them unredeemable. The staff cuts had included that former CEO Kevin Bruner, but Bruner would not go quietly, suing Telltale in relation to his departure. Telltale issued a formal statement in response to this. They brandished the claims as meritless, stating that the company is now working to turn around the decline that it experienced under Bruner's stewardship. After the cuts, day-to-day life at the developing studio started to alter an additional time under Hawley's gaze. Micromanagement of the creative teams was now kept to a minimum, the management team working harder than ever to improve the company's fortunes. And on the surface, brighter days were ahead of them. The Walking Dead's final season was to be a send-off to the original Telltale engine. Titles released after it would switch to the Unity game engine. A deal had been signed with the incredibly adored Netflix series Stranger Things, an idea rejected by Bruner and his team back in 2016. And Telltale would announce the partnership with Netflix at E3 2018 in June to a great reception. Finally, after the quite tyrannical sounding rule of Bruner, after the harsh periods of crunch time for the poor developers, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was a way out for Telltale Games. The future remained bright. And that's why what happened next was such a shock to everyone involved. The partners, the fans, and the employees. On the 21st of September 2018, Telltale received a call. It was bad news for the company. CEO Pete Hawley made an announcement shortly after. He delivered the message no one wants to hear in their lifetime. Telltale Games would undergo a major studio closure. 90% of the workforce, 250 talented, innovative, hopeful developers were told to pack their bags and leave the studio for the final time that day. They were told to clear their desks and be out of the building in the next 30 minutes. They would receive no severance pay. Melissa Hutchinson, voice actor for Clementine in the Walking Dead series of games, was in the middle of recording her lines for an upcoming episode for the final season when the news came in. The recording session was promptly ended. Only 25 employees would remain to fulfill any outstanding obligation the developer had with its partners. The morning call Hawley had taken came from one of the studio's last remaining potential major financial backers. Some theorize this to be Lionsgate. Whoever it was, the backer would pull all funding out from the company abruptly, leaving Telltale hung out to dry. After Bruner's time at the helm, the company was on its last legs as it was, and while many of the developers in the company may not have known how dire the situation actually was, this was to be the final nail in the coffin of Telltale Games. The laid-off employees were given an additional 3-hour period 3 days later to return to the studio to collect anything that they had left behind. Telltale would be sued by the laid-off workforce for the lack of notice given. Despite this, the second episode was released on time on September 25th, 2018, with 2 more episodes left to make. Telltale valiantly attempted to get the game finished via some potential external partners, also trying to get those partners to hire the personnel that had been laid off to complete the job. It was Robert Kirkman, creator of the Walking Dead comic book, that would step in with his own production company Skybound Entertainment to finish off the final 2 episodes of that final season, even hiring the original development team from Telltale to finish the work. Back at HQ, the 25-strong skeleton crew worked on the company's commitments up until October 11th, 2018, where Telltale would begin the slow, sad process of liquidation, liquidizing all the studio's remaining assets. Excruciatingly slowly, Telltale Games would begin to fade away from all digital stores until only The Walking Dead remained. How apt. You know, at the beginning of this video, when I welcomed you all to the Telltale show, I wanted to really capture the wonder of the franchises Telltale brought to us all. The experiences these games gave us at the time we all played them are invaluable. That very first Walking Dead season is among many people's favourite ever titles. It's definitely up there on my list. It's the perfect example of how to craft a relationship that gets you invested right from the word go, and for that, many aspiring writers will be thankful for the lessons it taught them. It and others were great games, and that's why it's a shame to see the company go. Why did Telltale Games fail? Mismanagement, mistreatment of their employees, and above all else, ambition. The higher-ups were too ambitious and a little bit scared of going under, so much so that it made them blind to the impact it was having on the workers below them. They couldn't see how it had changed them as people. They wouldn't see their missteps. They only saw the bank numbers roll in. The risk in licensing major franchises only really caught up to them when the quality began to fade, when the love for the purely game-making aspect of it all deteriorated into ones and zeros, into dollar signs and bank statements. A company founded on dragging a forgotten genre of games back to the very pinnacle of the gaming industry had lost their way entirely, and that's such an awful shame. Telltale Games, as it was, had fallen, but there remains some hope in this cautionary telltale, as in August 2019, a new company, LCG Entertainment, would acquire several major Telltale assets with the bold announcement that it was to be relaunching the company. Telltale Games are back. In some form anyway. The new studio operate in Malibu, California under the leadership of James Otterley, the CEO. Their first port of call re-released the backlog of Telltale franchises back onto every online store out there. They've even offered freelance work to former Telltale employees with the potential of full-time jobs down the line. The move isn't without its controversy, however. Some of these said former staff have called for LCG Entertainment to pay off the existing Telltale debt to the employees. Others have called for the boycott of any game from the new Telltale Games, so not looking too good. The CEO responded with the fact that they are not in the financial position to carry out most of these demands, stating that they cannot right the wrongs of the former company. Now, Otterley has implored the public for a chance to be judged by their work, not by the prior company's actions, ensuring that this iteration of the company would provide a stable, non-crunch time environment. They want to try to do things the right way. I, for one, though, would would like to see what they can produce. For Telltale Games had something about them, a unique charm that hasn't been captured by any other developer before or since. They had personality, an element I believe to be lacking in today's gaming landscape. Like a forlorn partner, I take them back at the top of their game in a heartbeat. The new company has gone silent, so we'll wait to see what they can come up with. And for now, that's your lot, people. The history of this special company contains the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. It's a story of faultless triumphs and glaring crucial mistakes. And yes, there's hope for the future with this new developer, but one thing is for sure, the old Telltale Games isn't coming back. So allow me to be the last in a long line of people to say goodbye. Telltale Games, farewell.